Hello, everybody. Um, it's API review time again. We only have 6 issues this week, so hopefully, like last week, we can wrap early. But I don't know. There's a red one with a really long title, so we'll see how far we get. Uh, all right. So first up, we have a revisit on unreachable exception 35324. Assuming Steve that you agree that we have enough people to make a decision.
Yeah, I just wanted to know the answer.
Indeed. Uh, so when we talked about this in the past, um, we marked it as being in the system namespace and extending system exception. There were some comments about it being special. Jan came back and said that the Stack Overflow exception is extremely special and thread abort exception is extremely special, and this exception should not be in any way, shape, or form special. So I think that we want to say that the base class is just exception. And then there's the question of the namespace. We had a mail thread that was inconclusive. There were some comments on the issue, inconclusive. Um, so, does anybody want to express any strong opinions as to the namespace of unreachable exception?
I think system makes a lot of sense. Um, I'm not sure I 100% agree that it shouldn't be special, but if Jan says it shouldn't, then I guess it shouldn't. Uh, so I think otherwise it looks good to me with as it is there.
I'm not against system, but if the purpose is, primarily for compilers, code analysis, things like that, I would question why it's not system diagnostics or system diagnostics code analysis. But um, I don't have a strong anything against system. It's just, systems, everyone gets system.
I'm looking to see what we have in diagnostics code analysis.
So I do like diagnostics as an alternative to system, but the reason I think system is better is because um, it's not just going to be compilers using this. This is also going to be used by people writing their own patterns, by people right-clicking and adding fixes for pattern expressions and things like that. So it's going to be one of those namespaces that basically everyone imports. And so I would think that system is the right default, because then by default you can use unreachable exception in your code for to correctly represent the state without having to add additional namespaces. But short of that, I think code analysis, diagnostics code analysis would be the next best, because that's something else that most modern code should now be including, just by extent of enabling nullable by default.
Assuming you believe that nullable has value. Um,
Yeah, but on the other hand, if it's in system, then IntelliSense might suggest it to many people and they might misuse it.
I don't think you can really misuse an exception called unreachable. I think the word is fairly self-explanatory of I'm throwing this because this path should be unreached.
yeah, I mean, to me, this is just a fancy ship assert. So I like diagnostics. It looks like diagnostics code analysis is all attributes except for the one type that's an enum being passed into one of the attributes. So I like system diagnostics, not code analysis. And and I think that the comment of, well, it's part of a pattern. I think debug assert is also part of many people's patterns, and that's in system diagnostics. So now we have 3 different proposals. Would anyone like to back one of the horses? Or mount a fourth one?
I like the code analysis because it specifies the intent. Like, I know that it doesn't deal with running or executing anything. It's about code analysis.
I was going to say I like diagnostics because it very much is, in my mind, aligned with asserts. You you don't expect to get here, and you want this to do something that basically blows up if you do get here. In fact, you could imagine the implementation fail fasting or something inside its constructor. Not that we would, but if we wanted it to be quote quote special. And code analysis, I think I had actually suggested it, or maybe I just, plus one did earlier. The downside to it is everything in code analysis today is about tools being able to inspect code, analyzing code, and they typically are analyzing metadata rather than IL. That's not always the case, but it is probably the majority case, and this is not something that's in metadata.
I would also go for system diagnostics. I think it's pretty marginal. It could be system as well, just to be with more exception types, but the debug assert argument convinced me.
And diagnostics is my third choice out of the three, but in a ranked in a ranked choice voting system, that means that my vote goes to diagnostics.
We all have, everyone literally, I think, has a different ordering.
Yeah. The one thing that I don't like about diagnostics is, like debug assert, there's not a lot. I think there's big code bases that use it, but not necessarily. It's not as common for regular projects like samples and things like that, and it basically means that everyone's using list becomes one longer. I'm not even sure diagnostics is in the default includes for new projects if you're using the new template.
Is it really everyone? I mean, look, I'm just looking at the PR that is proposing to add this, and it's only modifying like, I don't know, 30 files or something.
I think it depends on your on the code base. If you look at something like the JIT itself, there's actually a unreached helper method that basically handles correctly asserting, including in release code, and handling like fail fast the JIT as an execution engine exception. And so various code bases do use this kind of thing extensively.
I'm not pushing back on the various code bases part. It's the everyone part.
I think with quick fixes, it will become fairly standard. I imagine that Roslyn will provide a quick fix to add this as the default case. For example, if you're saying an enum is fully implemented, then one of the code fix options would be say that it's unreachable. Because today I think by default it throws a not implemented exception when you use the code fix.
I don't know that unreachable is actually the right answer there in general.
Yeah, not implemented is the state that the method is in. If you do an override of a method, it should not auto-generate to unreachable.
No, this is for like implementing patterns over enums.
Right, but even then, if I have a switch that handles 3 cases for an enum, I haven't implemented the cases for the other values. I haven't gone so far as to say, I promise I can never get here. And we definitely wouldn't want a code fixer inserting throws for unreachable that might actually throw unreachable. I mean, the whole purpose of it is if you get one of those, something really wrong has happened. And if a code fixer is automatically adding that for cases that you missed in a switch statement, I think that's setting ourselves up for seeing a lot of these in production.
Yeah, I mean, basically these should never happen. So argument validation is still an argument exception, not an unreachable exception.
I could see a code fixer that did that if you exhausted, all of your defined enum values, and then the compiler is saying, yeah, but obviously someone could pass in an integer here, maybe unreachable would be a reasonable thing if it saw that you were also doing validation earlier in the method or something, but it feels wrong to me.
Yeah, I mean, if you've already checked an is defined, then sure, but otherwise it's you can take any integer and cast it to an enum, modulo details, and So just because only 3 things are defined in the enum doesn't mean you've handled if somebody passes you negative 12.
Right.
And so unreachable, again, that would be an argument out of range exception or some other argument exception, not an unreachable exception.
For switches as well. I mean, Roslyn we already added an exception for that Roslyn generates throws for like missing cases and switches, right? Then we already have an exception for that.
I think so, because I think it was mentioned in the discussion previously. Maybe it was in the mail thread. Because I think it extended invalid operation exception. And I had some grumbling about that.
Are you talking about exceptions utilities dot unreachable in Roslyn?
No, I'm talking about
Switch expression exception.
Oh,
Yeah, that one.
Do we think it's worth talking to the SDK team on system diagnostics and system diagnostics code analysis not being part of the default implicit using list?
Not really. People who want it can add it. If a lot of people complain, then that should be driven by user feedback, not by us having a belief on what the default should be. Otherwise, the default would be everything. At least that's my opinion. All right, so system diagnostics, directly extending exception, sealed exception type, still doesn't need serialization constructors. Any final feedback? Sold. Probably the fastest. Blocking issues disappeared. All right, for our other red issue, infloat 63801. Mr. Goodman.
This one, yep, this one's going to be an interesting one. So we previously exposed infloat along C-long and C-long. It's an ABI primitive type in interop services that's used for ensuring that that floating point values are passed as float on 32-bit systems and double on 64-bit systems. So it's basically int pointer or inint, but for floats. This is particularly required on Apple hardware where they use CG float, which operates effectively the same, and it's required for iOS and general Mac interop. Xamarin, before we ever acquired them, exposed their own type system.infloat, all lowercase. And as part of the .NET 6 release, they're going to be moving that to the Objective-C runtime namespace. However, they've been getting feedback from the community that they'd rather not continue having that type in, and that they'd rather normalize on the existing system runtime interop services infloat type that we've exposed. And so after talking with Rolf and Merrick and others, the general agreement is that if API review approves it and we expose effectively all the standard operations, so addition, subtraction, increment, decrement, division, multiplication, etc., on infloat, then they would be willing to drop their built-in type in favor of this type instead. And so the proposal is that we do that. We effectively extend infloat from being just a wrapper type to actually being a full type with all the operator support, all the relevant properties, etc. And they would forward down to the relevant float or double APIs. The one downside of this, well, I guess there's two downsides. One, it's a it's a bigger change for Xamarin users moving from mono-specific to .NET 6, in that they both have to they have to change the namespace, which was already going to be required, but they also have to change the casing of their infloat type. The other downside is that for .NET 6 in particular, we cannot retroactively add this to the surface area without shipping a 6.1, which at this time is not believed to be worthwhile. And so users, Xamarin users targeting .NET 6 will have to use a workaround and manually perform operators themselves for that release. And in .NET 7, we'll be able to simplify that down to just using the built-in ones.
What's the workaround? Sorry, I didn't completely understand that.
They would have to explicitly extract the double value from infloat, perform the operation, and then
I'm in suspense.
Yeah, I think your audio dropped, Tanner.
So is it that we can add the type, but we can't add all the operations in .NET 6? So you can cast still?
It looks like we have.
Am I
the type.
back?
Yes, now you're back.
Yeah, you're back. Sorry.
Okay, Teams crashed on me. So I missed whatever was asked.
Well, we heard you up through. They'll have to extract the double value and then.
Yeah, they'll basically have to do infloat.value, do the operation, and then that will convert back to, and then they'll have to cast it back to infloat. So rather than just doing x plus y, they'll have to.
Teams doesn't like Tanner today.
At least this time it informed us he's dropped instead of.
Is there a new patch? Because I had a weird Teams issue this morning also.
So, well, the thing that I think wasn't clear to me is nfloat already exists in .NET 6. It's just adding all these operators, which is the API proposal. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding. So yeah, we definitely have the type in 6. If we didn't have the type at all, we could just expose it via a NuGet package. But since the type exists, things would get interesting if we. I mean, I think technically we would have the ability of, with a higher version NuGet package, you would see the new version of the type and it would unify correctly. But I don't know. It sounds scary. Tanner's gone again. Yeah, so I think that the proposal is simply we have the struct and he's slapping the rest of the mathy interfaces on it, which makes all the rest of this appear. So it's, do we want the infloat type to be a first class number?
I mean, still hidden away in interop services. Like, what's the harm? I guess, like, assembly bloat?
Yeah, I mean, to me, if I don't see a problem with declaring it to be number-like.
And in general, it seems fine to me from a concept perspective, and then whatever the APIs are that we say thou shalt implement if you're a floating point number, it gets those.
Yep.
Which I'm
I
assuming
know
that's exactly what this is.
nfloat kind of screwed up Xamarin a little bit, right? Is that the main concern for why we wouldn't do this? Is there something additional here?
How did it screw up Xamarin?
There was like a competing nfloat type that they already had in mono, right? Or was
Oh,
it
there is.
Objective-C something? Yeah.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
Tanner was saying.
So
and then
there's-
they're moving namespaces.
There's little
Right
infloat
now.
that they're moving out of system.
I'm on my phone now.
Okay.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I came into the office today, and apparently Teams does not like my office computer, and it's just crashing every time I start it.
Fun times. So really, we're at the to catch you up, Tanner. Our belief is simply that you're slapping all of the numeric for float or numeric interfaces that are relevant to float on here, and that this is just the consequence of that. Is that true?
Yes.
And
Um,
there was the question of, is there any reason we would say no?
I don't believe so. The only reason might be that the difference that the user experience that is present to users between .NET 6 and .NET 7, but I didn't think that was a huge consideration. The one notable call out is really iConvertible. We've previously said we're not exposing that on any new types, particularly not primitives, because it's not generally extensible to arbitrary types. And so we might just say the same applies to infloat here. But otherwise, I don't think there's any questionable surface area or any other special considerations that would make us say no.
So I see and have highlighted an implicit operator from infloat to double. Did we make an implicit operator from inint to long?
Yes, for inint to long is implicit, and int to inint is implicit, but inint to int is explicit, as well as long to inint. So in the cases where it's lossless, it's implicit, and in the cases where it could be lossy, it is explicit.
Right. But this is by making it implicit here, we're making the implicit assumption that there will never be anything with a bigger than 64-bit native size.
That's the same assumption that we've made for int pointer.
That's why I asked if we do it on
Yeah.
inint, because personally I would just say no implicit operators or no implicit outs, because that's limiting. But I guess we will. What's the destructive phrase? We'll burn that bridge when we get to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, long to nfloat is implicit in this proposal. Couldn't that lose?
Yeah.
precision?
So technically yes, but the C# compiler, as well as most languages, for legacy and back compat purposes, and because they didn't know what they were doing, allowed int and long conversions to be implicit to floating point types, even though they are potentially lossy. And so this just matches what the underlying floating point type allows.
I mean, is that a thing that we want to maintain, or?
Yes, because despite it being incorrect, the consistency experience here is more important. And if the language were to ever support infloat itself directly, then it would likely maintain the status quo of implicit conversions are allowed, the same as it would do for half, a theoretical quad type, etc. this isn't just like a C# specific behavior. This is a C, C++, C#, Rust, Go, WASM, basically like every language out there has this quote unquote issue.
Fair enough.
And then I think the one other note is that there's an annotation at the bottom of this is happening in .NET 7. And in .NET 7, we are going to finalize the generic math APIs. And so it might be worthwhile just saying the surface area here mirrors float and double. And so therefore would also implement I binary floating point IEEE 754 of infloat. Therefore, it's usable in generic math as well.
Right, because yeah, I noticed that none of the interfaces you declared actually looked like the mathy interfaces, and then I assumed that it's because the floating point interfaces are still being defined.
Yeah, they're still being defined, and so it's not worth explicitly calling them out here. But we could accept, as we've done with a few other cases, this API is effectively mirroring what float and double are, and therefore any API added to one should be added to all three, or all four in this case, since half exists now as well.
And in the case of the things like epsilon and max and min value, the interfaces can only describe the static properties.
Correct.
So by just defining them as static properties here, we don't need to do it's a const, which I guess it can't be. So it's a static read only here, and then the interface has the same thing and then just wraps it. So we'll just let general git elision happen.
Yep, and static properties are more efficient than static read-onlys, so that's beneficial as well. For the case of small primitive wrapper types, at least.
Yep. All right, and so, yeah, why do we care about iConvertible?
The only reason that's listed there is because Xamarin's system.infloat implements it. But like I called out at the top, it might be worth saying that unless Xamarin absolutely requires this, and my expectation is that they're not going to, then we should basically say, provided Xamarin doesn't absolutely require this, then don't expose it, because we've said don't expose it elsewhere.
Yeah, and I don't think we did on inint.
Well, inint is int pointer, and I think that already implemented it. But we didn't for half.
Fair enough.
I might be mistaken there. Int pointer might have been special and not implemented it.
Yeah, because I feel like if it was in the original iConvertible, it would have been a named member.
Yeah.
Because all I see on it is iSerializable.
Is the reason for not doing iConvertible anymore just because of the lack of extensibility to new types, or like that you convert to?
Yeah, there's only a finite list of type codes, and so it really only works in the context of other primitive types. You can't add new members to iConvertible, so you can't exactly add new primitive types to it that everything supports. There's just all kinds of numerous problems with it that make it a not ideal thing for arbitrary user-defined types to implement.
And there's no real replacement for that interface, is there?
There might be with generic math. There's at the very least some generic create APIs, and there may end up being some iConvertible to or iConvertible from generic interface, which would allow more general usage, but there's still some open design points I'm trying to work through there, and that still has to go to API review.
All right, so I deleted the iConvertible. Any other feedback? Okay. Yeah, I do think that a thing that you may want to look into, Tanner, is if we published a NuGet package just with a version higher than a NuGet package of this called 6.1, would that unify correctly with the shared runtime? I think it would, and
So
that
so I
means that
think
people
what
could
we
get the API
could
for the future.
I think what we could do, and I'd have to talk with Stephen and Eric St. or yeah, I'd have to talk with Stephen, Eric St. John, and Jeff, but theoretically, we could do what we did with system runtime experimental. That is, we could ship a side-by-side package specifically for Xamarin that modifies the surface area to include these APIs. And then it becomes a Xamarin users opt into getting this on 6.1 for the reference assemblies. And the underlying surface area implicitly has it. But there's some potential open questions there about versioning and things that would have to be confirmed for us to determine if that was possible or feasible. The main consideration is that the underlying runtime, if you're not on a version of the SDK that includes the implementation changes, then you'd run into issues. But that may not be a concern for Xamarin, iOS, and Android in particular, which is the main scenario for 6.0. So we might be able to make that work and say that it's only supported for iOS and 6 effectively.
Sounds like a thing to research. All right. Add cancellation token to stream readers read methods 20824. Adam?
Yes, could you please scroll? Oh, press the link that is at the top of this post.
Okay. Please always update the top post. That makes it easiest to
Okay.
discuss.
Apologies, I will do it next time. So to tell the long story short, text reader has both read line async and read to end async. However, we don't have an overload that accepts a cancellation token. Other methods, read block, read, etc., they do. These two particular methods don't. So we would like to add new methods that allow you to cancel the operation. And from the implementation perspective, we should also discuss whether they should be returning value task or a task. I think that when it comes to read to end async, this method is going to read entire file to the end, which means it's going to allocate a lot of memory, and it's most likely going to be executed only once. So I don't think that there is a point of using a value task here. That's why I would go with task. For readline async, I believe that there are some scenarios where we might have some data buffered, and reusing iValue task source would allow us to save some allocations, which makes value task a good choice for it.
Before just deferring to Steve, I will see if my neural net is correct on here. We don't really care how much the operation allocates, but it's readline async. On average, someone is going to directly await it, and it itself won't yield. But read to end async will probably yield. Once it's going to probably yield, it's allocating a thing anyway, and then use task because it's nicer. Right, Steve?
I didn't 100% follow what you said, but it sounded about right. I think in general, task is easier to use. It's hard, or said another way, it's harder to get wrong. And so it's still sort of all default, and then we want you to use value task for situations where um, both performance is going to be more of a key thing, and it's likely that you could do better than task, and you're going to be the 99.99999% use case is awaiting it directly. And so, read line async, especially if you're dealing with a file with lots of small lines, it's reasonable you could potentially cut your allocation in half or something by using a pooled value task. And you're going to be awaiting it in a while loop or something. You're very rarely going to be saying readline async dot continue with, or storing it into a dictionary or something like that. So value task is pretty reasonable. Read to end async, I mean, you're not going to be reading a whole file as a string into if you care about perf.
Mhm.
So I think task is reasonable there. I would be fine with value task on read to end async as well, but I don't think it really buys us much.
So I kind of feel, as someone who's misused value task a lot, and thanks Steve for submitting the PR to ASP.NET, catched it a while back, that yeah, it is easy to misuse, especially if they end up being pulled and so forth. I could see read to end async, like giving you the result immediately if backed by like a memory stream or something. But at that point, why aren't you using arrays or memory or spans or something if you really cared about perf?
Well, and even if it does give it to you immediately, it's still, there's a string, right? So unless you were always reading the same string over and over, which would be pretty unlikely.
Doesn't that apply just as well to readline async?
It does. However, I think it's more likely that those strings are going to be smaller. Right, you're talking about lines which could be empty, they could be a few spaces, they could be 8 characters rather than a million characters. Could they be a million? Sure, but like if you're reading lines from a file, it's more likely these are going to be pretty small things versus gigantic things that are going to be on the large object heap or whatever. If you're reading lines individually as well, it's more likely that you're doing so in some kind of loop, rather than if you were saying, I can totally see a situation where you want to read a whole file and cache the result. It's much less likely, I think, that you're going to read a single line and cache the result. Again, this is all a gray area, so we're trying to pick the best balance.
Yeah, like that's the thing that kind of annoys me about it, is that there isn't more of a bright line. Like if text read is going to add this value task API for readline async, it kind of feels like closing the door when the horse is out of the barn. Like to be like, oh, but value task is too dangerous for read to end async. Like if it's just a usability concern, like we're already exposing value task in this other API.
That's what I think. What you're saying is why not do it for read to end async as well, and that's why I said it. If we think it's meaningful, we could. I think it'll be very rare for it to be anything other than a value task backed by a task. But I don't have my resolve has weakened in general. I still think task is the right default, but anytime I put up a fight, I get a lot of pushback.
Yeah, I mean,
I would note that we have file.readAllText async that would probably be more appropriate for people who want to just read an entire file and cache a task somewhere. The read to end is kind of extra, right? Because it implies that you did some reading already and now you just want the rest of the file, which seems kind of maybe rare for that scenario.
or that you don't know what kind of stream you're getting, / you have something like a deflate stream on top of whatever the opposite of deflate stream is. So deflate stream in the other mode on top of a file, and it's like, well, now I just want all the content.
True.
So yes, if you know you're going to a file, maybe the file read all text async is better, but for the benefits where streams come in, read to end async is a thing. But yeah, so Stefan, I think I got that right this time. Really, it's task is the default, and you have to argue for value task. And I think that it's the people are claiming readline async meets the value task use. The strings will be small, so not large object heap. Read to end async, maybe LOH a lot. Granted, that should have nothing to do with whether or not the caller is expected to. Really, to me, the part I understand it is if you would write anything other than await the call, it should be task. And so once there's a non-trivial expectation of that, it should just be task. Value task is you're doing it quickly. It's expected to not yield in the average call, but like maybe 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 4,000, it will have to yield because it has to go acquire more data. And so I can see readline async being the I'm fast, just give me something, don't double the allocation here of creating the task. Versus read to end async, again, it's once you're possibly going to save that as a task and do a bulk await on it later, or you're going to do a continue with because you're Steve and you know how to use that correctly. And so yeah, I think this is the right shape, or task all around is the right shape, but I don't think value task for both is the right shape.
Yeah, my pushback isn't that strong. I was just trying to figure out where this kind of fuzzy line is, and I think you guys did a good job explaining it.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with our position is we have to have this conversation for every single API, but that's sort of the nature of where we've ended up because of the complications of value tasks, and so you have to kind of fight for it. Especially in the situation where it's overloading something that already exists, because it's, if someone's doing read to end async and they're already storing it into a dictionary or something, and then they go and add the cancellation token argument, and now all of a sudden it's changing the return type to something that's more dangerous, and hopefully they've enabled the analyzer, but probably not. So yeah,
I mean, if they're putting it into a dictionary, I guess unless they're doing it as an inline creation with var, that would just fail to compile because value task isn't implicitly task, right?
well, because be storing it as an object into a dictionary, but yeah.
Touche. People do write object dictionaries.
Yeah, but I think that the common usage of readline async will be iterating in a loop and just reading entire file. And in plenty of scenarios, we will be able to save some allocations by using value task. For read to end async, I don't see such a possibility.
Yep. So I think we have that, which really is just the same thing that was in Adam's proposed diff, just spelled differently.
So what do we think about the argument made by the most recent commenter on the issue that even if we don't need cancellation token overloads for things that have memory overloads that take cancellation token as a matter of form, if an overload exists without a cancellation token, there should be a cancellation token version of it. I can kind of see it. Like, people might not know the translation and want to be able to cancel their operations, but
I guess I don't quite know what the comment is.
so their comment is like, yes, you can rewrite your reads to use memory if you want to use a cancellation token, but like, what's wrong with just adding cancellation tokens to overloads that omit it today?
Well, so the problem on this one, and so I guess now I'll turn this to Adam for an implementation question, is this is a virtual, and we're adding an overload to an existing overridden virtual. So basically, all we're going to be able to do in this is throw if cancellation requested, and then call the one without cancellation as the base implementation. So the cancellation is very limited. Because if somebody's overridden read to end or read to end async without the cancellation token, we probably want the new one to call that one. So we can't just rewrite it in terms of read again, because virtuals are a pain in the butt. That's why you should never add them. So saying we just go to all the methods that don't take a cancellation token and add an overload that has a cancellation token has the same problem of how are we going to plumb it into the universe, and are we adding enough value by doing so? And I think on these, we know the cases that people want it. Again, especially for readline async, it's probably not that it was a long-running operation. It's that you've started some other operation and you want the cancellation token to fire, and you could have checked it yourself, but fine, we'll pass it into the thing. Read to end async, you really want to be able to cancel, and I think we need to take any of our text reader implementations and make sure that they actually do the cancellation. But the base type on this means that any random extension text reader won't. So, again, back to don't make virtuals. But otherwise, like if they're non-virtual methods that we're overloading, then we can totally make them work in terms of cancellation, and then we should do so. But I assume Adam and co have already done that assessment.
Yes, we did.
I was gonna say, did I really bore you all to sleep? All right. Any other feedback? Random access set length of a file handle, 58376.
Yeah, so again, I can give a short introduction. So as you know, FileStream has both possibility to get the length and set the length of the file. And in .NET 6, we have introduced a new type called random access, which exposes getLength method, read and write methods. And apparently I have missed setLength when I was doing the initial proposal. And recently I have run into the situation that I really needed it. And basically I had to do a workaround. I had to, again, create a file stream from a save file handle just to be able to set the file length in the scenario where all I have is a save file handle.
And I guess it'll do whatever behaviors file stream set length has.
Exactly.
Out of curiosity, what is that? Truncate for smaller and fill with zeros for larger than the current size?
Yes, and throw if given stream does not support seeking. So it's a pipe or a socket.
All right, so I double checked get length returns a long, so having set length take a long seems correct. Any feedback?
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Add I equatable to equals overriding value types 63687. Go ahead,
So
Steve.
we've previously piecemeal dealt with 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't know how many issues over the last year where someone comes along and says, well, this value type is overriding equals but doesn't have a public equals method that is strongly typed to take that struct. Can we add one? And we say, sure. And we go ahead and we add it. And each time we've said, oh, we should really have an analyzer that does that. And we do have an analyzer that does that, but we haven't enabled it in .NET Runtime because we have a bunch of types that we would need to do this to. And no one did the legwork to go through and say, what are all the types that we would potentially want to add I equatable of T to, and thus have a strongly typed equals method. So I went through and found all those types. I basically turned on the rule and drove the errors to 0 to see what we would need to do. And so that's what this issue is showing, is basically the top bucket are the types that the structs we have, the public structs we have that already have a public bool equals T other, but don't implement the interface. And so for those, it would just be slapping I equatable of T onto them. And then the second box are the ones that don't implement the interface and only override equals object and don't have an equals T other. And so we could go and implement the interface and add public bool equals T other if we so chose. And then the rest of them here, so the next one is the only type that implements I equatable of T but doesn't override equals object, which we should probably fix. And then the last 3 are ones where the rule is firing, but I think we should just suppress it. Hash code overrides equals but throws not supported. Nullable overrides equals but has special runtime support. And streaming context is basically binary formatter.
Should we also look at types that supply the equals method but don't have an operator equals?
We could.
I think there's a couple of those here. A couple of those exist as well. And
I'm sure that's true. I think that'd be a fine thing to look at, but I think that's a separate discussion.
That would also extend to potentially implementing I equality operators, which is probably a separate analyzer in consideration. One question I had was, all of these look fine to me. I'm not familiar with SQL that well, so SQL double, is that functionally a double? Does it support NaN? And therefore, do we need to ensure that it follows the correct implementation for equals in NaN consideration?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I also don't know that it's relevant just because it already implements, it already overrides equals and has operators. It just doesn't provide the strongly typed dot equals that takes a SQL double.
Right. Well, the question being that if they have an existing implementation, it looks like they're forwarding to equals now, and they're not considering NaN, then that's potentially problematic for its use in hashing. In fact, if it has NaN at all, this implementation is broken for hashing, and so if you put it in a hash table and anything's a NaN, then
sure. I'm just saying that that's pre-existing. That's already the case.
Okay.
If that's true.
Yeah.
I guess I don't think that that's relevant to whether we add a public bool equals SQL double.
Well,
yeah. But the question had been like, if they're not exposing it, if they are exposing something today and it's not compatible, then that's problematic. But if they're not exposing anything as well, then we have to ensure that's considered when, like, when all of that's done, basically.
I guess the implementation will have the exact same behavior as the equals.
Yeah. So the only is does our generic dictionary type care about I equatable of T as being special? Like, on any of these, are we going to change how, if they were a dictionary key, how it would get processed?
I don't believe so. I think if you don't implement iEquatable, it just falls back to the equals override.
The equals override or the well, I guess if anything, it would be calling the dot equals object method. Like that would be where it would be.
Right. That's what I
falling
meant by
back.
the equals override.
Okay, because they did override the op equality. They didn't, but they
Yeah,
didn't
not
override.
the equality operator, but the method you're currently looking at. Override equals.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think I was getting confused between which implement one today, which implement none, and which implement the interface but not the like. There's three different combinations that I think I got confused on which one double was.
Yeah. So this is the duck type to iEquatable of t. This is they semantically but don't duck type to iEquatable of t. And this is how the hell did we get this wrong? I think. So, Steve, you were the PM for cancellation token. So as probably the only one who can answer for any of these why it's in the state that it duck types to iEquatable but didn't declare it. Do you have any idea?
I messed up.
Okay. We didn't have an
That's the best
analyzer
answer
and
I have. I don't know why we didn't do it. It's a one-line
Yep.
iEquatable. I'd like to say the generic interface didn't exist then, but I'm pretty sure it did. So
pretty sure it did.
I can't think of a single reason.
.NET 4, .NET 2. Yeah. Okay, so you think that all of these are just we didn't have the analyzer and we forgot to write down a piece of metadata.
I believe that's the case. Maybe not all of them. I think some of the ones in that top bucket, I think iEquatable actually didn't exist at the time. Like, I don't know, like there's diagnostic counter sample, that's performance counter. I think that was a .NET Framework 1.0 thing. Module handle, I think that was a .NET Framework 1.0 thing. So a few of those I think were pre the interface, but certainly, I mean, I was joking about cancellation token. I think we just left it off for whatever reason. And
Yeah.
For array segment and array with offset, do those need the same special considerations that span has with its equatable implementation? Or does it have that special consideration?
I don't know, but what is that consideration?
Span, one of the span API says like don't do this because it does reference equality instead of value equality. And array segment is functionally like a span.
I mean, it already has the method. It just needs to say this method implements the interface.
Yeah, none of these were. So there's the other rule, which is all structs ideally should be iEquatable of t, and this isn't adding that rule. This is what things already provided equality semantics but didn't declare the interface.
Right, but in the case of span, we can't implement interfaces, but we also have explicitly obsoleted equals because people using it is misleading. And I was wondering if array segment falls into that same category where even if we implement the interface, we should technically be obsoleting it because it doesn't do what users expect.
I see. Your question isn't. Your question is really, should we go the opposite direction rather than making it implement the interface? Should we actually slap obsolete on the method?
Right, because array segment is functionally the legacy version of span. It's slow span, and
that would be challenging given the equals override. Like, you can put one of these things into a dictionary. I'm sure people do. We'll break them. If we change the behavior to throw or something, we'll break them. If we don't, they're not going to notice because it's not going to provide an obsolete compilation error because they're not calling the method directly.
Maybe we should just obsolete it in general.
Does memory of t have the same consideration? I feel like array segment is more like a memory of t than a span of t.
I think memory of t has the same consideration as regular span, but it doesn't have the obsolete, so maybe not. Yeah, it just looks like it silently does what what array segment here does, which is compare the object, the index, and the length without obsoleting, which means there's the same. Oh, but it is editor browsable never.
Right. Well,
oh no, that's just the object overload.
yeah, and read-only memory at least does declare that it's I-equatable of t, so it's explicitly opting into equality.
Seems odd that we obsolete using the span compare because it's likely not the right thing, but we don't do it for memory of t when users will hit the same pit of failure.
Is the span specialization to essentially make length of 0 and null differentiated?
No, it's span does it specifically because if you do if you have a string, like if you slice a string and then compare that slice to an equal literal string, it will return false because it does referential equality rather than value equality. And so array segment has the same problem. If you create an array segment of characters and you compare that to a string literal converted to an array segment, it will return false. And the same with memory of t. They all do referential equality, and so none of them will say that foo equals a substring foo.
Okay, so it's more of an implicit conversion is happening that they may not be aware of when you're comparing it to a literal?
Yeah, or even just like even explicitly creating it in the case of F#. It's problematic across the board because users likely expect it's doing value equality like normal string comparisons do.
So I'm looking at spans equals obsolescence, and it suggests using the equals operator, which presumably has the same problem. So
Yes,
why
which
is it
is
okay
just
for
this.
the equals operator? Yeah. And not for the equals method?
I don't know. I don't know why we did that.
Like, it's even the recommendation. It's like, oh, well, this is obsolete because it doesn't do what you expect. But, you know, the equals operator, which most people would expect to do the same thing, is what you suggest to use. I don't know.
I think we obsoleted span.equals not because isn't there something about it being a ref struct that actually causes a problem? Or no, am I misremembering?
It says it's because it can't be boxed.
Right. So that's why we obsoleted the equals overload. I think Tanner's correct that there is this equality problem with spans because it doesn't have the semantic that lots of people expect, but I don't think we obsoleted because of that.
Yeah.
Maybe it's an analyzer or something. I'm pretty sure we raised something in that case.
Because I think it's just this one can't work because span could never become an object, and then we didn't define span.equals span because it's just like just write equal. For some reason, I guess it's a method table entry. Who needs it?
So if span were to implement I-equatable T like memory, like, is that possible without boxing? Like if you did the right generic constraints or whatever, would it matter?
I don't think you can put generic constraints on a with ref types, right?
Well, they can't be a generic constraint, but I feel like you could say public read-only ref struct span of T is I-equatable of memory of T.
Without any constraints, and it should be fine.
I think you could, but I feel like we say only ever be I-equatable to self.
Makes sense.
So do we need someone to take this offline and research why?
Well, for the thing that is proposed here, which is declare the interface on the duck typeable ones and declare the method in the interface on the ones that already provide the semantic but require boxing, and make adjustment rule follow our guidelines. Like, these all seem fine.
Yeah, I think they're fine. I just had open questions about the NaN case because I thought the NaN case was in the first bucket, which was they implemented equals to other but not I equatable, which would have been problematic in the case of dictionaries because then it would have started using the I equatable comparison. And then I had the question about array segment because apparently I misunderstood how span was doing its comparison and why. So I think it's fine overall.
Okay. I don't actually know how to write this. Let's go to proposed. I think that's really all I can say because there's too many things to talk about. Yeah. There. Something more than just nothing.
Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. And since it's in PR, I assume next is just going to be purge.
Yeah, I put it up as a draft. The easiest way to get the list was to actually work through it.
Mhm.
So now I need to go actually make it compile.
Okay, so for this one, we reviewed it at the same time as we reviewed the ARM SHA intrinsics, and we approved this. However, unlike ARM, which has a single ISA that exposes, or that has two ISAs, one for SHA 128 and one for SHA 256, or SHA 1 and one for SHA 256. Intel and x86 in general exposes a single ISA, just named SHA. And for various implementation as well as consistency reasons, we need to continue matching what the underlying hardware exposes. And so this is bringing the proposal back as instead of having SHA-1 and SHA-256, just have the public class SHA, and then prefix each of the each of the method names with SHA-1 or SHA-256. So it goes from SHA-1 dot message schedule 1 to SHA dot SHA-1 message schedule 1, for example.
Which looks like that's what the Intel assembly name for it is anyway.
Yeah.
So I feel like with the intrinsics, there's usually an is supported and then a complicated, we need a co-defined class on the 64-bit type.
Yeah, there's technically this is public abstract class SHA inherits from x86 base, and then there's a public is supported in a nested x64 class, but that was already approved, and that's effectively a de facto required for the implementation here, so I didn't feel like typing it up. I also forgot to type it up, so.
Okay, did we previously talk about how A and B are terrible variable names or parameter names?
Yeah, I believe so, and we went with that because that's we didn't have better names, and that's what the underlying intrinsics used. Things like that.
Fair enough.
Unless the bottom API approved proposal had different. Nope, it was A and B there too. A, B, and K.
Okay, so your final proposal here says rounds, and this had things called 4 rounds and 2 rounds. Is that rounds just ended up being the right answer, and 4 and 2 were over specific?
Whatever the approved names are should match what we approved last time, but prefixed with SHA-1 and SHA-256. So I might have miscopied them in the top post. So it should be SHA-256 2 rounds and SHA-1 4 rounds.
We call them twee rounds because of a typo.
So before state 1 and state 2 were A and B. Does that matter?
Yeah, they should continue matching what we approved last time, just with the change to be prefixed and in the same just SHA class. Apparently, I'm very bad at updating top proposals.
All right, and then it gets what inside here?
There's a nested class called capital X 64, and then just with is supported and no members. Which we have to do to ensure that derived classes can correctly be implemented and expose the relevant members.
And next 64 is baseless.
That would inherit from x86 base dot x64. Although x86 base might be SSE2, I'd have to double check the spec and see what the pre-check requirement is. Which I don't have on my workbox, unfortunately. But it's either x86 base or SSE2, one of the two.
Okay. All right, so we have AB, AB, and then this was supposed to go back to AB. And AB. Okay. And I don't care about the right-hand sides. But I do care about that. Alright, I think I caught all of the adjustments. All right. So yeah, the only outstanding thing is whatever word goes there, but
I'll double
that'll be
check
right in
the
the PR.
manual.
GitHub, sorry, not GitHub. YouTube suggests that it's a direct ISA.
I don't believe that's correct.
Fair enough.
It,
We'll let you guys battle that out in the PR.
yeah, this uses IM 128, and so therefore, as per the Intel manual, it is at least dependent on SSE, because otherwise the SIMD registers are not available at the hardware level. So it's at least SSE, and I believe much like Pickle Mold, QDQ, and AES and others, it's dependent on SSE too, because it uses integer-based operations.
Fair enough. All right. SHA 256 is 2 rounds. SHA 1 is 4 rounds. Message schedules 1 and 2. Next E, and 256 doesn't have an E. Okay. Okay. All right. Matches the general rule of do whatever the spec says. And I see us being clear. Do we have any meta discussions this week? All right. Well, as I observe that we have once again managed to catch up with the backlog, which I feel is unusual for this time of year, but cool. I declare this meeting adjourned. Have a nice week, everybody.
Bye bye.